Carole was financially independent. She lived a good lifestyle. She lived in a nice part of town.
Bhayani spent a lot of money very quickly after he killed Carole.
I think Carole smelt a rat. I think Carole threatened. She threatened to go to the authorities.
Carole Waugh was 49 when the man she'd lent £52,000 to killed her. He hid her body in a garage for over 3 months while he drained another $200,000 from her accounts. Here's how his own greed brought him down. But to understand how Rakesh Bhayani was caught, you have to understand who Carole Waugh was and what she'd spent a lifetime building. This story starts quietly, but it won't leave you unchanged. Before we begin, drop a quick comment and tell me what the weather is like where you are right now. Your presence here truly matters. Just a quick note, this story includes some fictionalized details to convey the emotional weight. The truth behind it is what matters most. Carole Waugh had spent 49 years building a life no one could take from her, until she went looking for someone to share it with. She owned her flat outright. The 2-bedroom apartment in Marylebone, one of London's most expensive neighborhoods, carried no mortgage. Every payment had been made in full. She'd earned it through years working for an oil company in Libya, a place most people wouldn't go for any amount of money. Carole went. She worked. She saved. By the time she returned to England, she had something that belonged entirely to her. She lived alone, but not unhappily. Her life had structure. She traveled when she wanted. She saw friends. She kept her finances in perfect order. But in early 2012, something shifted. Maybe it was the quiet of the flat. Maybe it was the realization that independence and isolation aren't the same thing. Whatever the reason, Carole decided to look for companionship. She went online. That's where she found Rakesh Bhayani. He was charming in his messages, attentive. He asked about her work, her travels, her life. He seemed interested in the details. They arranged to meet in person. Before the date, Carole did something she always did when something mattered. She called her mother. She told her about Rakesh. She sounded hopeful. What Carole couldn't know from a profile and a few messages, was that Rakesh Bhayani had fraud convictions. Multiple fraud convictions. He had a gambling addiction severe enough that Ladbrokes, a company that makes its money from gamblers, had banned him from their establishments. He'd been barred from the very places designed to take people's money. But how do you spot that in someone? How do you see the pattern when you're meeting someone new? When you want to believe in the possibility of connection? How do you know that the person sitting across from you has built a life on deception? Carole met him anyway. The date happened. And then there was another and another. Rakesh became a presence in her life. He was good at conversation. He knew how to make someone feel seen. He had the instincts of someone who'd spent years reading people, finding the gaps where trust could slip in. What he didn't have was money. What he did have was debt. The kind that piles up when you can't stop gambling. The kind that comes with threats when you can't pay. The kind that makes a man look at a woman who owns her flat outright and see not a person, but a solution. Carole had worked in Libya. She'd lived in compounds behind security gates. She'd navigated a country most expatriates found dangerous. She'd managed risk her entire professional life. She understood caution. She practiced it. But here's the bitter mathematics of fraud. The people most careful with their money are often the best targets. They have something worth taking. They've built something worth destroying. Carole had spent decades being responsible, and that responsibility had given her exactly what a man like Rakesh Bhayani needed. She didn't know that Bhayani had a pattern, that he'd borrowed money before and never repaid it, that his fraud convictions weren't anomalies, they were his method, that his charm wasn't personality, it was professional skill. She didn't know that when he looked at her mortgage-free flat, He wasn't seeing her home. He was seeing his next move. Carole Waugh had spent 49 years building a life no one could take from her. She'd worked in one of the world's hardest places. She'd earned every pound. She'd come home to security. But Rakesh Bhayani had never repaid a debt in his life, and he was about to ask her for money. The first loan Bhayani asked for was small, just enough that Carole barely noticed the amount leaving her account, a few £100s. He needed it quickly. He'd pay her back by the end of the week, and he did. So when he asked again a month later, Carole said yes, this time a bit more, still modest. And again, he repaid her on schedule. Every pound returned, every promise kept. That's how trust works when someone builds it carefully. Borrow a little, repay it fast, wait, borrow again. Each cycle tightens the pattern until the person lending stops calculating risk and starts believing in loyalty. Carole had spent her career managing contracts. She understood terms and timelines, but this wasn't a contract. This was someone she cared about, someone who honored his word. Every repayment proved it. The amounts grew. £1,000 became 2,000. 2 became 5. Each time, Bhayani repaid her. Carole watched her account balance drop and rise again, steady as clockwork. By mid-2011, when Bhayani asked for £40,000 in cash, Carole didn't hesitate long. It was a significant sum. But she'd seen him repay every loan. She believed she was helping someone turn his life around. She gave him the money, £40,000. She gave him £40,000. And then, weeks later, Bhayani was arrested, counterfeiting, passing fake currency. The police held him on remand, no bail. Carole could have walked away. The man she'd lent £40,000 to was sitting in a cell facing fraud charges. She visited him instead. She traveled to the prison, signed in, waited in the visiting room. When Bhayani walked in, she didn't ask for her money back. She asked how he was holding up. She believed in him. Even the arrest didn't shake that belief. People made mistakes. People could change. When the court requested character references, Carole wrote 1. She described Bhayani as trustworthy, reliable. She used a phrase that would later be read aloud in court. She called him one of the good guys. The woman who had never needed anyone's money was now funding a man who had never stopped stealing it. Inside the prison, while Carole sat in the visiting area believing in redemption, Bhayani was meeting other inmates. One of them was Nicholas Kutner. Kutner was 48. By the time he and Bhayani crossed paths in late 2011, he had accumulated nearly 100 fraud convictions. Not charges, convictions. Almost 100 separate times, the courts had found him guilty and he'd cycled back through the system. Fraud wasn't something he'd done. It was what he did. The two men recognized something in each other, not friendship. Recognition. The kind that happens when two people who operate the same way realize they're looking at a mirror. Bhayani had spent months building Carole's trust, engineering a perfect escalation to £40,000. Kutner had spent decades doing the same to dozens of victims. They talked. They compared methods. Outside, Carole continued writing letters, continued visiting, continued believing Bhayani deserved a second chance. Inside, the two men were learning something valuable. Carole had already given £40,000 and written a character reference to the court. She kept showing up. She kept believing. And neither man had ever met someone quite so willing to trust, quite so committed to seeing the good in someone the evidence said wasn't there. In that prison visiting room in late 2011, two men with long criminal records sat across from each other, both specialists in fraud, and understood something useful. Carole Waugh was willing to give far more than either of them had imagined, and soon Bhayani would be asking for more. After his release from prison, Bhayani told Carole he needed £12,000. This time, he said, to save his life through gambling rehabilitation. The counterfeit charges had been resolved. He was out, and now he was explaining that prison had given him clarity. He could see what gambling had done to him. He wanted to stop. He needed professional help. Treatment programs cost money. £12,000 would cover it. Carole had already given him £40,000 in cash. She'd visited him in prison. She'd written a character reference to the court calling him one of the good guys. And now he was asking for more. But this time, he framed it differently. Not as a loan, as an investment in his recovery. As the money that would finally break the cycle, the fraud convictions, the gambling addiction, the arrest, £12,000 to save his life. Carole said yes. She'd built a life where £12,000 was an amount she could afford to lose if it meant helping someone get better. She believed in second chances. She believed people could change. She gave him the money. Weeks passed. Bhayani remained part of her life. He called, he visited, he gave updates on his progress. Then, Carole came home one afternoon and found her flat had been broken into. Items were missing. Her belongings disturbed. Someone had been inside her home, the Marylebone flat she'd earned through years of work. Someone had violated the space that was supposed to be hers, alone. The door hadn't been forced. No windows smashed. Whoever had done this either had a key or knew how to get in without leaving obvious damage. Carole stood in her flat, looking at the evidence, and had to face a question she'd been avoiding. What do you do when the person you're trying to help might be the one stealing from you? She could call the police, report the burglary, let them investigate. Let them ask who had access to her flat, who knew her schedule, who might have motive. The investigation would lead exactly where her suspicions were pointing, but calling the police meant something else. It meant admitting to them, to herself, to everyone who'd watched her support Bhayani, that she'd been wrong about him, that the £52,000, the prison visits, the character reference, all of it had been based on a misjudgment. Calling the police would mean admitting she'd been wrong about him all along. And Carole wasn't ready to admit that yet, so she made a different choice. She confronted Bhayani directly. Whatever she asked him, whatever suspicions she voiced, whatever evidence she presented, he had an answer. He always had an answer. That was his skill, not just taking money, but knowing exactly what to say when the person lending it started to doubt. Maybe he explained the burglary as coincidence. Maybe he offered to help her find out who'd done it. Maybe he turned the question back on her, hurt that she'd suspect him after everything they'd been through. Whatever he said worked. The woman who had given Bhayani £52,000, who'd written to a court calling him one of the good guys, who'd visited him in prison and believed in his rehabilitation, she came home to find her flat burglarized, and she suspected him, and she asked him directly. And he gave her an explanation, and she chose to accept it. She didn't call the police about the burglary. She asked Bhayani, and he had an answer. Whatever he told her was enough to quiet her suspicions, at least for the moment. She stayed. She kept lending. She kept trusting. But something far worse than burglary was already being planned. April 16, 2012. Phone records would later document the last time Carole, Bhayani, and Kutner were together. The records showed they met that evening. They traveled together to Carole's Marylebone flat. All three entered. It was the last time anyone saw Carole Waugh alive. What happened inside that flat remains undocumented. There were no witnesses, no recordings, no testimony from Carole herself. The only evidence of violence would be found months later, a single stab wound to the neck. But on April 16th, no one knew Carole was missing. No one knew to look. The phone stayed active. Text messages went out to her contacts. Her accounts showed withdrawals, transactions, activity. To anyone checking, Carole Waugh appeared to be living her life. Days passed, then weeks. Her flat stayed occupied. Her phone kept pinging cell towers. Her bank cards kept processing purchases. May became June. June became July. No missing person report. No concerned friends calling police. No alarm raised. 3 months. Carole Waugh had been missing for 3 months. And then, in July 2012, 2 people tried to rent Carole's flat. They each paid deposits. They each received signed agreements. They each showed up on move-in day with their belongings. They discovered they'd been scammed. Same flat, same deposit. 2 separate victims standing in the same Marylebone apartment, wondering which one actually had the lease. They went to the police. Not to report a missing woman. They didn't know Carole was missing. They reported rental fraud. The senior investigating officer received the case when those 2 would-be tenants walked into the station with their deposit receipts and conflicting lease agreements. It looked like straightforward fraud. Someone had collected money for a flat they didn't own or had no right to rent out twice. The address led to Carole Waugh's flat. The name on the bank account led to Rakesh Bhayani. Police brought him in for questioning. Bhayani sat across from investigators and told them a story. Not a simple story. A detailed, carefully constructed story that explained everything. Carole had gone to South Africa. Voluntarily. She'd planned it. In fact, she'd planned an elaborate insurance fraud scheme. She was going to disappear for 18 months, let everyone think something terrible had happened, then resurface claiming she'd been robbed. She'd collect the insurance payout and start fresh. She'd told Bhayani everything before she left. He was helping her, managing her affairs while she was gone. That's why he had access to her accounts, her flat, her phone. She'd given him permission. She'd asked him to make it look like she was still around so no one would suspect she'd left the country. The rental fraud? A misunderstanding. He was trying to cover her expenses. Things had gotten confused, but Carole was fine. She was in South Africa. She'd be back in 18 months, just like she'd planned. It was detailed, specific, confident. The kind of story someone tells when they've had time to think through every angle. How close did this lie come to closing the case before it truly opened? Some investigators found it plausible. A woman with money, traveling experience, connections abroad, why wouldn't she try to game the system? The insurance fraud angle explained the secrecy. The 18-month timeline explained why no one had heard from her directly. The story had just enough detail to sound real, but it had one weakness. It required Carole to have actually traveled somewhere. Flight records, border crossings, immigration stamps. A paper trail that should exist if the story was true. No one had asked him for specifics yet. Which airline? Which flight? Who drove her to the airport? The investigation seemed ready to close on his word alone. But someone was about to check the bank records. 2 people arrived at Carole's Marylebone flat in July 2012, each holding a lease, each having paid thousands in deposits for the same apartment. The first had paid £3,900. The second had paid £7,000. Both had signed agreements. Both had keys. Both had been told the flat was theirs. They stood in the doorway and understood they'd been scammed. The person who'd taken their money claimed to be Carole's brother. He'd handled everything professionally. Lease documents, deposit receipts, move-in dates. He'd convinced each of them separately that he had authority to rent out his sister's flat. They called the police. The senior investigating officer who'd questioned Bhayani about the South Africa story now had a new problem. Someone had been impersonating Carole Waugh's brother. Carole's actual brother was Christopher. He lived in Cumbria. When police contacted him about the impersonation, he hadn't known anything was wrong. But then they asked when he'd last spoken to Carole. Christopher and Carole talked several times every week, regular calls, routine check-ins, the kind of contact that builds over years. The calls had stopped in April. No calls, no contact, nothing. For months, Carole phoned home. She called her mother. She stayed in touch. That was who she was. She didn't disappear from her family's life without explanation, without warning, without a word. Christopher hadn't thought to report her missing because he'd assumed she was busy, but months of silence from a woman who called home several times every week wasn't normal. The rental scam that Bhayani had used to keep extracting money from Carole's assets became the thing that brought police to her door. His greed exposed him. The investigation shifted. This wasn't just fraud. This was a missing woman who'd been silent since April, whose flat was being rented out by someone impersonating her brother, whose accounts were still active, whose phone was still sending messages. The senior investigating officer brought in Fiona Hodgson Moore, a forensic accountant, to examine Carole's bank activity. What Fiona found was impossible. Carole Waugh had spent years working in Libya, saving methodically, paying off her Marylebone flat early. She was famously frugal, careful with money, disciplined. That's how someone owns property outright in one of London's most expensive neighborhoods. But starting in mid-April, the account activity changed completely. Thousands of pounds were being withdrawn every week. ATMs across London. Cash pulled out in rapid succession, the kind of spending that empties accounts fast. Someone had applied for a £200,000 bridging loan against her paid-off flat. The flat she'd worked years to own outright was being used as collateral for massive debt. The woman who never spent recklessly was suddenly burning through thousands every week. Except she wasn't the one doing the spending. Fiona laid the bank statements out. The timeline was clear. Before mid-April, careful transactions, modest withdrawals, the pattern of someone who'd managed money responsibly for decades. After mid-April, chaos. Huge cash withdrawals, loan applications, reckless spending that didn't match 30 years of financial discipline. Carole's lifelong frugality, the very trait that had allowed her to pay off her mortgage early, to build financial security, became the evidence that proved she wasn't the one spending her money anymore. The numbers told a story. ATM withdrawals across London, loan applications for enormous sums, a sudden shift from decades of careful saving to reckless spending, all of it happening after mid-April. All of it completely inconsistent with who Carole Waugh had been her entire life. The numbers told a story the woman herself couldn't tell anymore, because somewhere, Carole Waugh had been silent for 3 months. The financial records, phone data, and witness statements all pointed to the same place. A lock-up garage in New Malden, South London, rented by Rakesh Bhayani. Investigators had been following separate trails: the money, the phone, the car. Each one led to the same address. A man came forward who had sold 2 cars to Bhayani on separate occasions. The first vehicle had been confiscated by police, so Bhayani bought a second one from the same seller, a Volkswagen Golf. The man remembered the transaction. He remembered Bhayani. Witness statements confirmed that Bhayani had rented a garage in New Malden. The rental agreement was in his name. The address matched what the phone records were showing. Phone data placed Bhayani in that area repeatedly in the weeks after April 16th. Not once, not twice, multiple times. His phone pinged towers near the garage again and again. The financial fraud had started in mid-April. The phone went silent in mid-April. The rental scam began after mid-April. Every piece of evidence converged on a single locked door in South London. Every separate investigation thread, financial fraud, phone records, witness accounts, led to the exact same location. It was as if Bhayani's own trail had built the map to find her. 108 days. That's how long Carole had been in that garage. Investigators stood outside the lockup in early August 2012. They had the rental records. They had the phone data. They had the witness statements. They had the timeline. Everything pointed to what was behind that door. Before we open that garage door, if you're still with us, comment one word for what you're feeling right now. Please note, what follows contains some recreated details to convey the emotional weight of this discovery. The truth behind it is what matters most. On August 2nd, 2012, police opened the lockup garage in New Malden. Inside was a Volkswagen Golf. Inside the car's boot was Carole Waugh's body. She had been there for nearly 4 months. The decomposition was severe. Identification required examination. But it was her. A single stab wound to the neck was found. The woman who had called her mother several times every week had been silent in a car boot just miles from her Marylebone flat. Undiscovered for 108 days. She hadn't gone to South Africa. She hadn't fled the country as part of an insurance fraud scheme. She hadn't voluntarily disappeared for 18 months. The woman who never missed a phone call home had been just miles away, unable to make any call at all. Carole Waugh had been mere miles from her home the entire time, not missing, not in South Africa. Silent in a garage rented by the man she'd tried to help, the man she'd given £52,000, the man she'd visited in prison, the man she'd called one of the good guys. The financial evidence had led them here. The phone records had confirmed it. The witness statements had filled in the gaps. And now, the garage in New Malden had given up what Bhayani's lies had tried to hide. August 2nd, 2012. Carole Waugh's body was found. The rental fraud that brought police to her flat had exposed the bigger crime. The spending patterns that didn't match her habits had proven she wasn't alive. The phone data that showed Bhayani near the garage had pointed to where she'd been all along. Now, Bhayani would have to face what the evidence already proved. His South Africa story was over. The garage had been opened. The body had been found. But he had one more story to tell. With Carole's body in the garage he'd rented, Bhayani had a new story. He and Kutner found her already dead. The South Africa narrative was gone. The insurance fraud scheme, the 18-month voluntary disappearance, the planned reappearance, all of it abandoned the moment police opened the garage in New Malden and found what his lies had been covering. Now, sitting across from investigators in August 2012, Bhayani offered a different explanation. He and Nicholas Kutner had gone to Carole's flat. They'd entered using keys Carole had given him, and they'd found her there, already deceased, already beyond help. They panicked. They didn't call the police. They didn't report what they'd found. Instead, they concealed the body. They moved it to the garage. They kept it hidden. And then they continued defrauding her estate, using her bank cards, withdrawing her money, renting out her flat, applying for loans against her property. The story was designed to reduce his culpability, not murder. Just fraud. Just obstruction. Just two men who made terrible decisions after finding a woman already dead and saw an opportunity they couldn't resist. Investigators didn't believe it any more than they believed the South Africa story, because this new story had the same problem the first one did. It required details Bhayani couldn't provide, and it contradicted evidence that already existed. The South Africa story was gone, but the lies weren't. Bhayani's second story tried to reframe him from murderer to opportunistic fraudster. But even this version required Carole to have traveled somewhere, to have planned something, to have set up the insurance scheme he'd first claimed. The story had changed, but the fabricated trip remained. Investigators pressed him for specifics. Which airline had Carole booked? What was the flight number? Who drove her to the airport? Where was the insurance payout in her bank records? Bhayani couldn't answer. Not with details that matched reality. Not with anything investigators could verify, because Carole Waugh had never gone to South Africa. She'd never left London. She'd never planned an insurance fraud scheme. She'd been in her Marylebone flat on April 16, 2012, and phone data proved who else had been there. The phone records placed Bhayani at Carole's flat that night, April 16th. The last night anyone saw Carole Waugh alive, not weeks later, not after she'd supposedly left the country. That night, every answer Bhayani gave contradicted what the financial evidence already proved. The ATM withdrawals had started after April 16th. The loan applications had come after April 16th. The rental fraud had begun after April 16th. All of it happening while Carole's phone sent messages she couldn't have written, while her bank cards made purchases she couldn't have authorized, while her flat was being shown to tenants she'd never agreed to let in. How do you explain away bank records, phone data, and a body in your rented garage? The interrogation transcript grew longer. Question after question, answer after answer that didn't hold up under scrutiny. Bhayani's name appeared throughout. He was the subject, the suspect, the one being questioned. But Carole Waugh's name appeared more. Her bank account, her flat, her phone, her mother who hadn't heard from her, her brother who'd been impersonated, her money that had been drained, her body that had been hidden, her silence that had lasted 108 days. In an interrogation about Rakesh Bhayani, Carole Waugh's name was spoken more than his. The evidence kept forcing investigators back to the woman who could no longer speak for herself. Bhayani's stories, both of them, had collapsed under the weight of evidence he couldn't explain away. The phone records placed him at the scene. The financial data proved Carole wasn't spending her own money. The garage was rented in his name. Carole Waugh's voice was absent from the interrogation room, but her name filled every page of the transcript. The case was going to trial, October 2013. Rakesh Bhayani and Nicholas Kutner stood trial at the Old Bailey, charged with the murder of Carole Waugh and fraud against her estate, totaling over £250,000. The trial exposed the complete timeline of what they'd done after Carole died. Bhayani had recruited women to impersonate Carole. He paid them to walk into luxury stores with her credit cards and purchase goods she'd never chosen. They signed receipts in her name. They showed identification. They acted as if they were Carole Waugh, spending money that belonged to a woman who'd been dead for months. The night after Carole was killed, April 16, 2012, Bhayani went to a casino. He gambled using her money. While her body was being moved to a garage, he was spending her cash on games of chance. Weeks later, he walked into a Bond Street jeweler and attempted to purchase £40,000 worth of diamonds, cash, from Carole's drained accounts. The jeweler refused the transaction, but the attempt was documented. The audacity was on record. The trial revealed Bhayani had recruited multiple women to pose as Carole in stores, a calculated fraud scheme that began before her death and continued seamlessly after, as if she'd never existed at all. Over £250,000. That's what Carole Waugh's death was worth to them. Bhayani's defense strategy was ruthless. He admitted to the fraud. He admitted to concealing the body. But he blamed Nicholas Kutner for the murder. He pointed at the man he'd met in prison and said, Kutner was responsible for Carole's death. Kutner's defense mirrored the accusation. Both men admitted to defrauding Carole's estate. Both admitted to hiding her body. Neither admitted to killing her. But the evidence told a different story. The financial records showed who'd been draining the accounts. The phone data showed who'd been at Carole's flat on April 16th. The garage rental was in Bhayani's name. The spending spree began immediately after her death. The women impersonating Carole had been recruited by Bhayani.
She lived in central London, which can be quite an anonymous place, very transient community.
The 12 jurors who heard weeks of evidence and financial testimony at the Old Bailey trial deliberated on what the facts proved. November 2013. The verdict. The jury returned to the courtroom. Christopher Waugh sat in the public gallery. Mr. Justice Wilkie presided over the trial at the Old Bailey in the autumn of 2013. The foreman stood. Rakesh Bhayani, guilty of murder. Nicholas Kutner, not guilty of murder. Guilty of perverting the course of justice for his role in concealing Carole Waugh's body. Justice Wilkie delivered the sentence. Bhayani received mandatory life imprisonment, the minimum term before eligibility for parole, 27 years. In his sentencing remarks, the judge described the crime as an act of great callousness born out of greed. Not premeditated, but calculated. Driven by money, enabled by Carole's trust. A verdict of guilty meant justice had been served. It didn't mean Carole Waugh would ever call her mother again. Christopher sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read. Justice for his sister. The man who'd killed her would spend decades in prison. The accomplice who'd helped hide her body was convicted, but Carole was still gone. November 2013. Rakesh Bhayani was convicted of murdering Carole Waugh and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 27 years. The verdict closed the criminal case, but it couldn't restore the mortgage-free flat Carole had worked years to pay off. It couldn't give her the 51st birthday she never reached. It couldn't bring back the phone calls her mother would never receive again. Some losses can't be balanced by any sentence. The trial ended, but Carole Waugh's story didn't. It became a warning that would outlast the verdict. Carole had worked years abroad to pay off her Marylebone flat, years in Libya, years of careful saving, of financial discipline that defined her entire adult life. She'd built something that belonged entirely to her. And then she'd met Rakesh Bhayani online, a man with fraud convictions, a man with a gambling addiction, a man who'd been banned from Ladbrokes for the severity of his problem, a man who had never truly repaid a single debt. She gave him her trust anyway. She lent him money, small amounts at first, then larger sums. £40,000 in cash, £12,000 for gambling rehabilitation. She visited him in prison.
Offenders like Bhayani, who are just brilliantly eloquent, they are very charming. I mean, I've been in rooms with them where I have had conversations and I'm laughing.
She wrote a character reference calling him one of the good guys. She believed in second chances. She believed people could change. And on April 16, 2012, phone records showed 3 people met and traveled together to her flat. Carole Waugh, Rakesh Bhayani, Nicholas Kutner. It was the last time anyone saw Carole alive. What was said in that flat on April 16, 2012, before the knife touched her neck? There were no witnesses, no recordings, no testimony from Carole herself, only silence where her voice should be. The question remains unanswered. The conversation that ended with a single stab wound to the neck exists only in the memory of the 2 men who walked out of that flat while Carole stayed behind. If she had lived, Carole Waugh would be 63 years old now. She would have continued calling her mother several times a week. She would have traveled. She would have managed her finances with the same careful discipline that had defined her entire life. Instead, the flat she'd worked so hard to own became Exhibit A in a murder trial. The case became a textbook example. Forensic accounting courses study it. Romance fraud awareness programs cite it. Not just because of what happened to Carole Waugh, but because of how the crime was solved. Carole's lifelong frugality, the very trait that had allowed her to pay off her mortgage early, to build financial security.
So he's brought in for questioning, and initially, like all good con men, claims to be completely clueless. Has no idea what they're talking about.
To own property outright in one of London's most expensive neighborhoods became the evidence that exposed the fraud. The spending pattern after her death was so incompatible with who she'd been that it functioned as her testimony from beyond the grave. Thousands withdrawn weekly from ATMs, loan applications for enormous sums, casino visits, luxury purchases, women impersonating her in stores, spending money on goods she would never have bought. The woman who never spent recklessly gave investigators the perfect baseline to spot the fraud, even after she could no longer speak. Fiona Hodgson Moore looked at the bank records and knew immediately this wasn't Carole. The numbers told a story the woman herself couldn't tell anymore. Christopher knew his sister hadn't called home in months, and that silence screamed louder than any alarm. The evidence converged. Financial records, phone data, witness statements, the garage in New Malden, the body in the boot of a Volkswagen Golf, the rental fraud that brought police to her door, the impersonation of her brother. The stories Bhayani told that collapsed under scrutiny. Rakesh Bhayani killed Carole Waugh to keep control of her money. The way he spent that money, publicly, recklessly, without restraint, is what convicted him. Carole Waugh had spent 49 years building a life no one could take from her. She'd worked in dangerous places. She'd saved methodically. She'd paid off her home. She'd earned her independence, and then she went looking for someone to share it with. She gave her trust to someone who saw her only as an asset to drain. In the end, the very quality that defined her, her careful, disciplined relationship with money, became the thing that brought her justice. He killed her to keep her money. The way he spent that money hanged him. Carole Waugh's name is remembered not just as a victim, but as the woman whose careful life became the evidence that brought her justice. This case changed how investigators approach romance fraud. It proved that knowing a victim, really knowing who they were, how they lived, what they valued, can be as powerful as any forensic evidence. Carole's frugality, her discipline, her years of hard work weren't just personal traits. They became the testimony she couldn't give herself. The lesson here isn't just about being careful who you trust online. It's about understanding that the people who care about you, your family, your friends, know you well enough to spot when something's wrong. Christopher knew his sister. He knew she called home. That knowledge mattered. Fiona Hodgson Moore knew that the spending didn't match the woman. That knowledge convicted a killer. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe to hear more.
If I were looking at bank statements and there was a concern that the person had been killed as opposed to gone missing, then I would be looking at the nature of the expenditure. Is this...
Leave a comment. Tell me what stood out to you most. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Thank you for listening. This story is based on a real case, the murder of Carole Waugh in 2012 and the conviction of Rakesh Bhayani in 2013.
To see him in the witness box telling lie after lie, what a performance. He was convinced that he was going to turn that jury.
Some scenes have been dramatized to convey the emotional weight of the evidence, but the core facts, the fraud, the investigation, the verdict, are real.
And the trial judge, Mr. Justice Wilkie, said it was an act of great callousness born out of greed.
My deepest respect goes to Carole's family and all those affected by this tragedy.